Welcome, everybody. We are so excited to have you join us today. Thank you for attending our webinar today about leading a legislative campaign. I am thrilled to be doing this in conjunction with my wonderful colleagues, Sabah Mohammed and Jerry Clark. A little housekeeping to get out of the way. We will be sharing the slides immediately after the presentation today, so you will have those. You don't need to take notes. And we're going to ask you to go ahead and use the question and answer box to put your questions in. And we plan to address those towards the end of the presentation today. And also just a note, there will be a recording. It will end up being up on our YouTube channel after a few days. And in the world of SMI advocacy, we have a lot of lingo, and we tend to forget that we have a lot of lingo. So we wanted to give you a definition of what we consider to be SMI. It's severe mental illness, or some of us will say serious mental illness or serious brain illnesses. And I think it helps to almost say those words interchangeably. And what we're talking about are various forms of schizophrenia disorders, bipolar disorders, severe depression, and any illness that has psychosis as a feature of it. And one of the things we really wanted to help you to understand today is that you do not have to be an expert to advocate. And I would I think I can speak fairly well for both Sabah and Jerry in saying that none of us were when we first started, right? We all had a reason to get into this work. And we started out and just did our very best. And the real advantage is that once you get started, one act of advocacy almost always leads to the next. And there's always other advocates out there who are adding their voices to the work too. And the more of us that are doing this, instead of little ripples, we can create some waves. And one of the big messages we want you to hear today is that your story alone can impact change. You are an expert in your own story, your own tie to why you're working on this, whether you live with a mental illness or you have a family member or you're a professional. Your story is really what moves legislators. We always want to try to provide data and information, but the stories, that's what changes their hearts. So we're each going to share a little bit about our story, what brought us into advocacy. So my husband and I have 2 adult children, and our son lives with a very severe schizoaffective disorder, and he's been sick for about 17 years. And it has been, like many of us, a real nightmare over that time. And we first started working in advocacy in a variety of ways, but at the first time going to the legislature was when we were asked to work on improving Iowa's commitment law to allow for AOT. So we met with Senator Joe Bokum, the gentleman in this picture here, to ask him to write the bill. He agreed. We somehow got that bill to pass. We did improve Iowa's commitment law. And during that time, we started forming relationships with a whole lot of legislators and other leaders. From that, a year or 2 later, we then had help getting a meeting with Kelly Garcia in the green shirt here. She is the new director of Health and Human Services in the state of Iowa. And their relationship with me allowed me to get that meeting with her. And that is something that you really need to realize, is that the relationships that you're developing are not just for one ask, they're for our asks over the course of years. And building those working relationships really makes a difference. And I'm going to go ahead and pass it to Sabah.
Hello, I'm Sabah Mohammed, Senior Legislative and Policy Counsel. I am also a big sister to a little brother with a diagnosis of paranoid schizophrenia. I always say I'm a big sister with a sick little brother just trying to change the world. Now, I say little brother, but his journey began when he was probably about 16, and now we are almost 20 years in, so he is very much an adult, but unfortunately, his experience has been entirely carceral, and that is what led me to do this work. I couldn't understand why my perfect little brother was suddenly running in with law enforcement, and finally, through competency restoration, we got the diagnosis of paranoid schizophrenia. In my infinite wisdom of the mental health system, I thought, great, diagnosis, he's going to some hospital and he'll come back better, the end. And that could not have been further from the truth. We just continued to spiral and break down as a family. And I could not understand why law enforcement was still involved if we knew this was mental illness. That led me to hours just trying to figure out what to do. And like Leslie said, did not start out as an expert. It took me a week of just Google searching what to do to even find treatment advocacy center, learn what a champion was, and learn that, oh, I had a legislative issue that I needed to take to the Capitol. So you don't have to be an expert, but you can get to where we're going. This is me some years later, actually not being just a big sister, but being a advocate and an attorney addressing the Maryland legislator this year, right before we passed AOT into law, assisted outpatient treatment. So we say you don't have to be an expert, but you will have to do your homework because you're going to bring your energy to this system for change. I would like to say this is where my moment of expertise really came full circle, but I still had to go back to my hotel room and lie in the bed because you're going to be reliving that story all the time for lawmakers and new audiences, and it changes people, and they want to come up to you and share that change and celebrate that change. And it can be a movement or it can be a personal moment, and using your story for changing laws is something you're going to have to balance, but you could become that smiling expert no matter where this journey takes you.
Hi, everybody. I'm Jerry Clark. This is a picture of me with my son Calvin in 2018 when he was living in supported housing in Seattle. And it was the closest he got to recovery after a 4-year crash through a really ineffective system of care. Unfortunately, he did not survive and died probably about 3 months after this picture was taken in March of 2019. I was deeply engaged in legislative advocacy that spring when he died, and I had already been working with legislators on amendments to the Involuntary Treatment Act law in the state of Washington. So there was a bill already being moved through committees when my son died, and so I screwed up every ounce of courage that I had. And about 6 weeks after he died, I sat in front of a Senate subcommittee and told my story and why they needed to amend the involuntary treatment laws in order to save lives. That bill did pass. There's still a heck of a lot of work that needs to be done. And so I'm glad that I learned how to start to engage in advocacy. It was probably the hardest time in my life that I could have possibly started to engage in the work, but it does galvanize me to continue the work in honor of my son, Calvin. So we want to get to know you guys a little bit. So we have a tool called Slido that is going to offer you an opportunity to give us some information about you. There's 2 ways to access the Slido. The easiest is if you have a separate device, such as a cell phone, and you hover your camera over the QR code that's up here in the left-hand corner of the slide, it will open a link to these questions. If that's not an option for you, you can go to slido.com and enter this number. I'm going to say it slow. It's 3436860, and you can answer that way. So we just kind of want to know, are you a family member, a professional? Are you someone who has a severe mental illness, a mental health provider? Or if none of those capture who you are, someone else who's interested in system advocacy, and that's why you're here today. So it looks like quite a few of you have accessed the tool, and we've got 83% of you thus far who are family members. About 7% are individuals with SMI, and an equal 7% are professionals in governmental or nonprofit roles. Looks like we don't have anyone identifying as a provider today, and we seem to have captured what you needed to tell us with the offerings that we had. So thank you for giving us that information. Oh, someone else interested in system advocacy has joined us. So thank you, whoever you are, wherever you are, for engaging in learning on the topic of advocacy. And we hope all of you learned something today that you can use to take an action. So I'm going to move to the next. We have 2 more Slidos. The next question is whether you are part of a grassroots group of advocates. So if you're working with a community or a statewide organization, or if you're working on your own, or if you're really not engaged in advocacy yet at all, but you just are here because you want to learn and you're curious. So looks like the answers are coming in. It's kind of fun to watch these green and gray bars move across the screen while we're getting data from each of you. So thank you for figuring out how to access Slido and contributing your feedback. It looks like a little over half of you are part of some kind of a grassroots network or group. About a quarter of you are individually considering advocacy, and a small percentage, but you are super valuable. Those of you who are brand new to advocacy, thank you for taking time to be here, to learn, to be curious. So awesome, fascinating, and helpful information. Thank you. One more Slido here. So whether you would rate your experience with legislative advocacy as being someone brand new, maybe you have some experience, or maybe you've done quite a lot and you would consider yourself kind of a pro. Maybe you could be up here doing this presentation with us. So let us know where you identify in terms of your experience thus far in legislative advocacy. So it looks like about 2/3 have some level of experience, and maybe a third are a little over, just a tiny bit over a third are pretty much brand new to the topic. So great. We hope that those of you who have some experience can add some layers to your knowledge base in this area from today's training. And those of you who are brand new, if some of this feels a little too heavy or in the weeds for you, totally okay. I've heard this phrase before that we kind of learn like an onion in layers. So if you're in the first learning layer, that's wonderful. You're going to take away something that will help you get started. And like Leslie said, advocacy begets more advocacy. So take away what you're ready to learn in the space that you're coming from in terms of your experience. Thank you. So here we go into the topic, legislative advocacy, where to begin. And I'm going to hand it back to Sabah.
Thank you so much. So you don't have to be an expert to advocate, but you will have to do your homework. So this is a picture of the Georgia Capitol, and that is where I had to begin. But it started with, like I said, researching, as even though I didn't know what I was researching for. I knew I needed change. And as I slowly began to understand what that change was, then I knew I needed to go to the Capitol and find a champion to change a law. The champion was just a legislator, my legislator. But I had to learn different things. Even what is session and how does it work? So session is when your political legislator convenes for their year. Some of you might be in states where it's a year-round session. Some may take an entire year-long break. Some may be for half of the year, like here in Georgia. It's okay if you don't know those things. That was something I did not know at all. And I had been to the Capitol, on field trips or to, protest something else, but never inside to get a law change. So you are in the right place if you just want to ask, okay, what session again? That's what we are doing this for. You want to learn the political language of your capital. Wonderfully, everything is online for most of our states. You can just Google what you're looking for. You can find timelines. You can find the calendars. It can get overwhelming if you get on the wrong page and it's all just build calendars and you're looking for just a calendar of the day, but keep searching and you can find what you want. And then learn the language of SMI advocacy. We have a lot of jargon. We have a lot of words. Even when I started, I was still saying things like, my brother's schizophrenic. Once you go into the Capitol, you speak for all of us. You speak for your family member, but you're advocating for the group. And the group needs to be on that same page with certain things. Some of it is just kind. It's the right thing to say, an individual with a diagnosis or a person with schizophrenia. Other is just knowing, is this mental health or severe mental illness, like we broke down in the beginning. So really basic, how a bill becomes a law is still very important to my work. I have to enter each city, each state, and go back to basics to see if they have something new that just doesn't pan out to what I'm used to. But these basics work from state to federal. You can watch the Schoolhouse Rock, I'm Just a Bill. I watch that and it kind of makes me tear up because it seems simple. And I watch that, I'm like, oh, that's all you have to do, but it's still so hard. So you watch that and it's actually relevant today. So how a bill becomes a law. A lawmaker will introduce the bill. They will write the bill or have the bill written according to their terms of their legislator. So don't worry, you do not have to write the actual bill. You will be advocating for the language of the bill and the outcome that happens. So let's say the yellow, my bill is introduced by a House member. That will go through the House. It will go to a House committee hearing. It will go a House floor action, and then it will switch over to the Senate. It will do Senate committee hearings, Senate floor action, and then go back to the original House. Usually in those committees, people are gutting your bill. They're adding wonderful things to your bill. They're saying how perfect it is, or they might let it die. You have got to be prepared for all of those, and we'll get to that later. If you are really lucky, and all things go your way, your bill will go to the governor and it won't be vetoed. It will be signed into law and it will go into action usually the next year. Georgia is just now doing some meetings from our mental health overhaul that happened in 2022. I sat in on a meeting today where we're talking about this very process and is what we wanted, what is actually happening. So the bill has a life and you'll be with that journey for a very long time. So you want to know your state lawmaker. That is number one. You want to know everything about them, which party they're in. That is super important. And you might even want to know if they have kids or a dog, if they're from somewhere you're familiar with or somewhere you're not familiar with. You want to know these things because you are building relationships, and it goes a very long way. You also want to know how they vote. What committees do they serve on? Which subcommittees do they serve on? If they are a part of sort of, say, a mentorship group, a lot of times you'll discover that these certain lawmakers run with other lawmakers who either they might, what do you call it? Sorry, campaign together. They might fundraise together. They might do a lot of different things and they have their own relationships. So you want to get to know that as well. And you do find those things out working when you just visiting the legislator and being ready to tell your story. You want to know if they voted on similar things in the past, because that will help you know what to do in the future. So next year, when I go to the legislator and we need to get imminent danger out of the law in Georgia, I'm going to go to everybody who passed that big bill in 2022 and say, guess what we can do to make that better? So you want to set clear goals and strategies. This is going to sound a lot like a game because as much as our family's lives are on the line, sometimes that's what you're doing when you go to the Capitol. You're playing this big bureaucracy game and you got to be able to pivot and move and make things happen. So you got to be realistic. Now, I say that with caution. If you're realistic, you won't go to the Capitol. So you have to be realistic in a way that moves bills and keeps you motivated, because sometimes it takes 20 years to pass a bill. That's what just happened in Maryland, but the bill passed. If you've ever watched Parks and Rec, Ann Perkins thought she was going to be working on that bill for 6 weeks, and it took a couple of years. So be realistic, and that means knowledgeable. Know your city. What are the moods and motivations in your state? So I'm in Georgia, and I know that my loved one caused harm, but it's tricky. If I say that at the Capitol, I'm in a law and order state. Ron Howard's book says people, no one cares about crazy people. Am I in a state that will be compassionate to my brother or not? I may have to pivot my story and get the same goals, but with a different outcome and a different lens on my story. I may not be able to say my brother hurt people. I might need to say how my mom was affected. That would resonate with the lawmakers in my state. So you need to know that about your state. You need to know what's popular for lawmakers. Like I said, Georgia loves law and order. So if I say, let's keep our communities safe with AOT, now I know how to approach lawmakers. Now, they might think taking imminent danger away makes our communities less safe. I still want that outcome. I have to pivot my story and show how that actually gets loved ones into treatment sooner. So know your goals and strategy, and you can pivot your story as needed. So when you start your campaign, either to oppose a law, introduce a law, or change the one word imminent in a law, you want to define your why. We want to get more people into treatment, make more communities safe, keep families whole. That can be your why. It can be broader or more narrow depending on what you're trying to do. You want to build your network. Who else in my state wants those same things? I look to NAMI. Are there any treatment advocacy parents in the state of Georgia? I look to the Sheriff's Association. They're tired of dealing with severe mental illness. They don't have the answers. So you build the network with people who want the same outcomes as you. You practice and you plan. I cannot tell you how many times I've flubbed someone's name because I didn't just practice how to pronounce it, how I start welling up because I didn't practice my own story. Those kinds of things are practice and you plan. You plan for visiting the Capitol. You plan for something not going right. You plan for missing your senator altogether and just going to see another committee member on your list. Stay the course. Like I said, I've had days where I wanted to see 10 senators and their aides, and I could only see 2 because it was just so emotionally taxing. That was a good day. I gave myself rest because I was going to come back the next day and the next day. So even if I saw a lot of you are advocates of one, stay the course. Define your why. So knowing your why helps you know your story and how to tell it. I have the elevator pitch version of my story. I have the long story of how and why all communities need this law change, but I know when to tell it and who to tell it to. And I've honed that story so that not only is it my story, the law that I want to change as an outcome of my story is in every single time I tell it. My brother should not have had to harm someone just to get treatment. And then my mother should not have had to lose her son just for him to get treatment. I can change that any single time, but the key element stays the same. Waiting for imminent harm causes irreparable damage to my loved one and to my family. And then you connect that so that it's workable and your story can become action. And the more the legislature knows that, the more they know how to put your words on paper, get it through all of those committees, and hopefully get it past the finish line. So when you build your network, like I mentioned, think about who cares about what you care about. Lawmakers, providers, other organizations, diverse family members is so important. If you look around and you're with a group and there are not diverse family members, it's time to pivot and glance at your blind spot. And there are lots of different ways to do this. What's interesting is you're here because of severe mental illness. That is the embodiment of DEI. So think along disability. Think along race and poverty. Who's missing that can more impactfully help us tell our story? And never, ever exclude individuals with an actual diagnosis. Sometimes visiting the Capitol can be taxing. Our loved ones can't even put on those suits to come in and tell their stories, but we have to get them at the table in whatever capacity they are able to take on. Sometimes it's just keeping, sorry, we'll get to that part later. Sorry. You got to practice and get organized. So this is what I was getting at. If you're working in a group, you talk about Who can do what? Who has certain connections? Who has certain skills? And how can they be utilized? Not everyone can do everything. Some people are going to be great at telling their story. My own mother cannot. She's way too emotional. So I take her story with me. But there's always admin to do. Sometimes it's not your story that needs to be sold. Sometimes it's that you are great at keeping minutes and getting that back to the group in a timely manner. Then practice your story by writing and speaking. I know I can sit right in a committee and start changing my testimony based off what I hear other people saying. At the beginning, I could not do that. I had to say the same thing verbatim every time, or I'd get sidetracked or I might cry. But I don't really cry anymore, but I do take in the things that I hear that sound like opposition and work on my response to that. So that is a part of getting organized and planning as well. So staying in the course. This is a matter of saying hi and thank you and schmoozing with politicians as much as it is of building your personal network. We never stop. We tell other caregivers in our circle to slow down. Maybe tell them to make a go for a walk playlist. When you've done enough, make your playlist and just go for a walk. Then come back to it. Your own mental health is how you stay the course, but also staying on top of the Capitol and knowing what's going on. I sat in a 2.5-hour meeting just to know what's going on. It is a part of my advocacy, but that's a part of your advocacy too. But remember, you can spread it out and share, know when to rest and know when to work. We're at a perfect time right now. Even though politicians might be listening, we're going into the holiday weekend. You take that holiday too. Right now, get back going on an awareness campaign. Maybe don't bother your lawmaker until they're ready to start up as well. That's a good time for you to rest too. Rest when session rests. Keep doing your advocacy work, but know how to play that game, if you will.
Thank you so much, Sabah. So when I first started doing advocacy work, I actually started with giving testimony. There were some folks at NAMI who knew my story and knew that I might impact some of the legislation that was happening. So I kind of went in with both feet straight into how am I going to tell my story. And at the time, the only way to do that in Washington State was in person. But that wasn't too long before COVID. And once COVID happened, it opened up this whole new way of potentially giving testimony through like a Zoom call or some kind of online platform. And some states also allow for written testimony in addition to verbal testimony. So you can go to your state legislative page and look up what are my options for getting involved. I think on Washington's site, the button that you're looking for actually says like, get involved. It might be something as simple as that, and then it will probably describe for you what are the possible ways that you might participate in a bill. So just a few basics about these three possibilities, and you can potentially do 2 out of these 3. So for example, you might be able to submit written testimony and also give an online testimony or an in-person testimony before whatever body is considering the bill. So you could be doing this in a specific committee, or you could be doing this for the floor, depending on where the bill is as it's moving. These are going to be the meetings that allow for public testimony. So you have to know that you're signing up for one of those opportunities that does allow for public testimony. So if it's in writing, keep it short, keep it direct. Sometimes you'll be allowed to attach a fact sheet. So like if you have some data about SMI that would be helpful, that supports the points that you're making, you can attach that. And then there's usually a place for you to choose whether you are for this bill, and that's usually going to be the button called pro, or if you're opposed to a bill, which is usually going to be a button called con. If you're giving online testimony, make sure that you've looked ahead of time to know what the rules are in terms of how much time you'll have. I remember during the kind of the thick of COVID, the Zoom screen in the Washington state legislature would have one square devoted to a timer. And it would start at 2 minutes and it would tick down. But sometimes at the beginning of that testimony, they'd say, we've got too many people signed up, so everyone's going to be limited to 1 minute instead of 2. So sometimes you might need to consider, will I be prepared to shorten or condense my testimony if the rules change in the moment? I decided for myself, especially when I was doing testimony online, if I could fit everything I was going to say on one phone screen, I was probably going to have time to say everything that I really most wanted to say. So that's one possible benchmark that you might consider. If you're giving in-person testimony, it's more personal because you're there in the physical presence of the lawmakers. So any opportunity that you might seize to make eye contact, to speak really slowly and clearly, and just make sure that you're really connecting with the people that you're talking to. That might mean that you want to have some key components of your testimony memorized so that you can really look around and make contact with the people that you're speaking with. So those are some general points about giving testimony. And now I'm going to talk about kind of the 4 basic parts of a testimony. So you do have to say your name. I haven't given testimony in all states, but I know in Washington state, you have to say your name. And I presume that that's probably true in most of the states. My more seasoned colleagues are nodding. So yeah, so you do have to remember to say your name. But some of the things that you might hear other people saying are not completely necessary. And if you're tight on time and you really want to focus on the really heartrending parts of your story that could impact what the lawmakers choose to do, you might want to think about skipping some of the things that might take up some of your time, such as naming the chair of the committee, or using some extra words like for the record. Those are not necessary. So even if you hear other people saying them, it doesn't mean that you have to say those things. It's optional. So for example, I decided that I wanted to just really hone down my opening statements. When I give testimony in Washington, I say, I'm Jerry Clark. I started Mothers of the Mentally Ill. Thank you for hearing me. And once I settled on that, it got way easier to get into the heart of my testimony more quickly. So the next, after you've introduced yourself, the next part of your testimony is going to be the place where you really want to kind of grab them by the heartstrings. Unfortunately, we're all here because we have rough stories. Our rough stories matter. And I want to share with you that while my son was still living, I was interviewed by an NPR reporter, Austin Jenkins, who worked out of Olympia in Washington state. He interviewed me inside of the Capitol in Washington, and he pointed to the state Capitol and he said, families like yours have no idea how important that building is and how much the people inside that building want to hear from you. He said, your stories mean more to your elected officials than all the paid lobbyists. They want to hear from you. And that just kind of cracked me wide open and made me realize how important it would be for me to show up and tell my story. So this second line after you've introduced yourself is where you want to maybe think about that. Like what key piece of your story is going to make them feel with you, make them at a deep, heartfelt level know that doing the thing you're asking them to do is the right thing to do. Ideally, your opening line doesn't require any explanation and doesn't need to have any acronyms defined or any jargon in it, but just really simple human language. So probably the most intense sentence I've ever said in the Washington State Capitol was, my son met criteria for involuntary treatment the moment he stepped off a hotel roof and plunged to his death. I said that, and then there was silence. Nobody moved. Nobody rustled their papers. I knew I had been heard. So after you've given them your opening line, you've got their attention, that's the part of your testimony where you can try to connect your story to the bill language itself. Drawing the short, so Sabat talked about define the why. So this is the part of your testimony where you can draw the shortest line possible to the why. So for example, when I was giving testimony in Washington State for a bill to potentially improve our assisted outpatient treatment law, I said this: I believe AOT could have saved my son's life. This bill enables more mental health professionals to file AOT petitions when they can clearly see a client needs that level of care. So believe it or not, those sentences took me a long time to write. And if you've ever heard the phrase, if I'd had more time, I would have written a shorter letter, it definitely applies when you're writing testimony. Sometimes I have to just kind of get in front of my computer. You could do it by hand. For me, I work better on a computer, and I just kind of type out like way too many words. And then for me, it's a process of elimination. And I start to decide what are the key words that are going to connect the dots the most succinctly for me. So yeah, I just want to say, like, those two sentences I just read to you did not just roll off the tip of my tongue. I actually spent a long time honing those sentences, and it mattered. So the final part of your testimony is going to be your conclusion. You want to end strong. A final clear why, say thank you. And then if you also provided written testimony, I've learned that my lawmakers always appreciate knowing that. So like they might be like, wow, I kind of want to know more from her. Yeah, so I can say, by the way, I also submitted written testimony that you can take a look at, or I also submitted a fact sheet for you. It's in the notes for this committee meeting. Here's a real simple example of one of my concluding statements. Please pass this bill so we can move forward in developing a compassionate system with AOT in our state. Thank you, and I welcome questions. I've never been questioned while giving testimony, but I've listened to testimony from other family members who have answered questions. So you can let them know that you're open to that. And then if you're working with a group, or if you have another friend in your advocacy circles, it can be really comforting and helpful if you practice asking and answering questions of one another, just to kind of have your sentences and your words organized in your mind and ready to go. So the first time I went to the Capitol, this is kind of funny for me to admit, the thing that I was the most anxious about was where I was going to park and whether I was going to be able to find my way to the meeting room where I was supposed to do this testimony. But there was a member of a NAMI affiliate who basically held my virtual hand and said, I'm going to tell you exactly where to park. And once you come an hour early, we'll meet in the cafeteria, have a cup of tea, talk about what we want to say. It'll be great to see you. And oh my gosh, that was so comforting to me. So if you're more seasoned and you're, bringing new advocates into the work, please offer that kind of help. And if you're new to the work, look around and see if there's somebody that might offer you that kind of support. I know Leslie and Sabah and I have all talked about how when we were really new to this, we would like maybe be halfway there or just parking and be like, can I come up with any excuse at all to just turn around and go back home because this is really intimidating? But we didn't bolt. We showed up, we shared our stories. And as hard as this can be, the rewards are huge because we are impacting change. And every single one of you has a story that can absolutely impact change. So thank you for your courage. Thank you for your wisdom. And thank you so much for being here. Leslie's going to close us out with a few final thoughts.
So one of the things that's important to remember is that we don't always win, right? Very often we have losses. We don't win the first time we try on things. And it's really important to accept those losses with grace and to be gracious with everybody who's involved, people that voted for us, people that voted against us. And the reason I say that is at that meeting that we had with the director of our Health and Human Services, Kelly Garcia, the woman in the green shirt earlier, I didn't win what I was asking her for. I didn't succeed in getting Iowa to apply for an IMD waiver, right? But by working carefully through the session and establishing a relationship, she invited me then that summer to be the lead-off speaker to give an advocacy presentation while the legislators were at the state hospital for a tour and a day to talk about improving the mental health care system. She asked me specifically to say a little bit about our story, the history of the crisis, a little bit about AOT, because she knew I was working on starting a program. And she asked me to provide state level solutions. It led to 4 bills that session, about 3 bills the following session, and also being invited gradually to serve on boards and commissions and committees and work groups. Because, like I said, one thing almost always leads you to more things, and you never know where it's going to go. And by saying yes to some of those invitations, you end up learning a lot more about how various aspects of the mental health care system work in your state. All those are really good opportunities because the other thing I want you to know is that we're not done learning. There's still so much more to learn, and establishing positive relationships with everybody you come into contact with, whether or not they're supportive of your work, is really helpful because it leads to more. So we wanted to share some tools and resources that we have at TAC, or the Treatment Advocacy Center. And one of the things we do encourage is for you to visit the TAC Action Center on our website. You can sign up for action alerts. We send those out for priority bills that we know are getting movement, and we're hoping to get people to email in to legislators to weigh in and try to get them to support bills passing through their committees or on the floor. We often sometimes we even send out information about if you need to try to get in there to testify. And there's also bill tracking on that area. You can click on a map and see the bills that are moving in your state that we're supporting. And the other thing I want to say here is that this is something that can be improved with two-way interaction, just like families and doctors and people with mental illness. Getting communication back and forth can be really, really helpful. So if you don't see a bill that you know about in your state that you think we should be aware of, please email us and let us know that, especially me. Because we have a wonderful bill tracking system, but it doesn't catch everything. So the more you can let us be aware of things, and if you have a certain bill that you're hoping for an alert on, reach out. We're happy to help you. And the more that the grassroots are talking to the national organizations, the easier it is for us to all support each other's work. We have a Facebook group called SMI Advocates of TAC, and if you're on Facebook, we encourage you to join that group. It's a great way to get information, but also to start networking with other people across the country. If you happen to be in California, Maryland, or Oregon, we have TAC grassroots networks, and those are also on a Facebook group. We encourage you to sign up for the SMI Advisor newsletter. We send out information about legislation that's recently passed and other bill trends that we're seeing. You might get ideas for bills that you might want to try to ask for in your state. And we are about to kick off an advocacy bootcamp series beginning at the end of September. And I think Nina's going to go ahead and put a registration link in the chat. And the registration for this is ending tomorrow. So if you're interested in that, this is really meant to be a series for beginning level advocates, people that don't know much about the whole SMI policy space. The reason we developed this is that we get reached out to by a lot of people across the country who want to start working in advocacy, which is terrific. But taking that on one by one is a little time consuming. So we're trying to provide information in a different way, and we're piloting this program. So for that reason, we're going to have about 25 in the first cohort. And we do plan to offer again. But we're starting out with a small group, and there will be a lottery to be able to get into that program, but still register because then you get on the list to learn about the next time we offer it. And with that, I also want to share our email addresses. So if we don't get to everybody's questions today in the time that we have allotted, please feel free to email us. We love interacting with people from all over the country and welcome you to email us about questions that you might have. And with that, I'm going to stop talking, and I think we're going to open it up to begin addressing some of the questions.
While we're waiting to see what questions are bubbling up, please note that Nina has put in the chat a survey about today's session. So please do provide us with feedback about today's training. We love hearing from you what you heard and how it helped and how we might continue to improve these training programs. So what do we have in the Q&A?
If you want, I'll start with answering one of them. I see that Robin put in there, is there a resource with the basic info on each legislator for each state? What I will tell you is that often on the state legislative websites, there's information about that. If you can't find it on the main one, know to also look up the Senate or the representatives or assembly, sometimes it's called. Sometimes the legislator specific information is there. And the other thing you can always do is Google them. Google will give you a lot of information about legislators as well, but almost always there's information right on the website.
Here's another question from Rhonda that I'll see if Sabah or Leslie have thoughts on. How can we get laws that are already passed enacted? So implementation of laws. Specifically, she gives the example of the new AOT laws in California.
Yeah, I will tell you that that's the challenge, right? What I recommend is working with the AOT implementation team at TAC. They really do a good job of working with people in all of the areas of the country to help get an AOT program started. That's how I got help to get our program started here in Iowa. We can't sit back, in my opinion, and wait for somebody else to come in and fix all the things. And I will admit that I spent a lot of time early on with our son's illness, kind of hoping and praying that somebody would fix all the things. And what I finally figured out that was, yes, somebody needs to get to work on fixing the things. It tends to be up to us to get in there and work with the local people, the providers, the judges, the lawyers who need to be involved to get those programs off the ground. But the AOT implementation team does that work day in and day out, and I highly recommend connecting with them. I think you can even write to them at advocacy at Treatment Advocacy Center. No, excuse me, AOT. Thank you, at advocacycenter.com or .org.
Yeah.
I botched that. Maybe Nina, you can put that in the chat for me.
Yeah, the AOT team also has their own full section on our website that's very easy to hook into, and they have a contact form on that part of the website as well. Marilyn's asking, I'm not a resident of the state where my loved one lives. Can I still advocate if I'm not a resident of my loved one's state? The answer is yes, you can. especially by writing personal emails to any of the lawmakers who might be engaged in a bill process or interested in a bill process. Your story absolutely is relevant to them. The only thing that you wouldn't be able to do is sometimes there are like pre-made forms for writing to a lawmaker that you're a constituent of. And if you don't have an address in the state, you're not going to be able to use those pre-made methods of outreach. But you can go to any state website and look up, who are the lawmakers involved in a bill process. And you can also sign up to testify. Other thoughts on that question, Leslie and Sabah?
The other thing I would say is that you can reach out on social media to see if anybody lives in that state, because sometimes that can be a connection. They might be able to forward something from you to a legislator that won't automatically get kicked out because your email isn't in state or your street address isn't in state. So sometimes that's another way to be able to be effective. Sabah?
Yeah, I was just going to say any type of grassroots measures, if you want to go around those, are always valid. There's nothing preventing you from doing that. And that's something that, like Jerry's story, they want to hear that story. They want to know what happens across state lines or why, especially if your states are next to each other, share sort of those county borderline resources. Just depends on the situation, but that's important. That's a part of our legislative process, how people move from location to location to help each other or to receive resources. So there's nothing preventing you from doing that kind of work, except for those barriers they said about your address. And those are easy to overcome. That's not like it's not like a rule or anything, is what I mean.
Well said.
Right.
So Kathy's
There
asking.
was one,
Yeah.
sorry, I accidentally moved one of Jeff's questions, and I was playing with it because I wanted to answer it because I had such an personal emotional experience with it when I first got into advocacy. Sorry, I put it down. Okay, he asks, could you please explain why the disability rights organizations are so opposed to legislation that will allow involuntary treatment for families that have a loved one with SMI? So when I used to get white hot angry at realizing like how my brother needs help, this is now a default asylum. My sisters had to move out to give my brother free reign to find devices, to eat all the food in the refrigerator, to kind of menace. And what do you mean? Isn't getting him in the hospital the answer? I could not understand. And you're probably in that same way. The more research I did personally, because I kept going, the laws keep you from getting wrongfully involuntary committed. And like the law protects you. And then I line that up with race. And I said, if anyone told me the law protected me, I'd go, no way. I will hold that line forever. We have not been good to people in need of severe mental illness in our country, in our politics. Like Ron Power's book, No One Cares About Crazy People. That's not gone. So we need to kind of swallow that pill and look at it like advocacy. How do we turn involuntary commitment, our best and only answer, into a positive experience when the history is so fraught? And it kind of tamed my white hot anger. And I thought, yeah, like, how do we now engage with these systems that were all oppressive? And we're like, come on, it'll be okay. We'll get you exactly what we need. And it's going to be tenuous. You stick to knowing that they have to hold that line and trying to use wisdom and reason and kindness. You show what AOT is, not what it's not. You say this is not the thing you need to be afraid of. And if they stay afraid, we kind of need to understand that, because we're the privileged ones, even though it doesn't feel like it. We're the well ones, so we just don't get it. And it's like, I wouldn't send my brother to a terrible place. I know involuntary treatment will help him because I know he comes back to us whole, and I know he doesn't take his medication. But that's not the line they're holding. They're saying never again will you do those atrocities of the past. and we have to kind of learn to advocate with them when we can. Now, I've had some opposition that was just wild. Stick to your facts, tame your anger, and know that some of that is coming from a good place, but some of the opposition is just a little bit ridiculous. And we don't want to punch down and get people to relive their worst days, because even if the involuntary treatment worked for you, that's still your worst day. We're trying to say, let's make that policy. So it's a balance. It's holding space for the harm that was done and showing AOT has stopped nights on the street. It stopped psychosis. It stopped incarceration. Is their common ground, and it just may be just that lifetime balance and give and take for me. And that was a powerful awakening in my advocacy that I like to share in that space. So sometimes that helps. If that doesn't help, we can talk about lots of other things and lots of other ways to advocate with instead of against when it comes to those groups.
We have only time for maybe one or two more questions. And there's one question in the chat that I'm going to make a little broader. It's a question about HIPAA laws, but what I'd like to offer to us to discuss is, so this training was focused on state legislative work. In terms of federal work, do either of you who have more experience than I in the federal space have anything that you'd want to say about federal advocacy? And then the question was specifically about HIPAA.
Well, HIPAA has I can't even say it, a clause for our loved ones. You are allowed to share. HIPAA is not a iron shut safe vault door. When someone is in danger, and we know our definition of dangerousness can be respected in guidelines with HIPAA, they can involve the family. It's not just this, you cross this line and now you've violated HIPAA and the world ends. No, they're allowed to share with us what is medically necessary to save our loved one's life and to get them into the treatment that they need. That is absolutely within HIPAA guidelines. I don't, federal, what is the question?
In terms of like, if you want to get more involved in federal advocacy, like federal legislative advocacy versus state.
I don't know. I say study. I mean, and Leslie really, because as in this work, I'm supported by Treatment Advocacy Center. So I don't want to give you those answers. And Leslie did it like on her own. So she can give you those family member answers. I didn't do federal legislation until I had the power of the org. So I'll let you.
I will briefly say that, I agree with Sabah that HIPAA already allows us to be able to have the communication that we need. Our job often ends up being educating the physicians and the other providers that they can talk with us. And if they won't, then we can give them the example of, well, maybe you won't tell me about my own son, but maybe you could tell me for most patients that have X disorder, this is what we'd recommend, blah, 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 blah. There's ways to work around what's already there. In terms of getting into the federal work, it's the same way. You basically email your own legislators, your own senators, your own U.S. congressman or congresswoman, and write to them about the bills that you're caring about. And, if you can secure meetings when they're home in district, in your state, I would do that, or engage with their staff, their policy staff, because they will take meetings. And it's a really smart way to start interacting with them if you're interested in that.
I did put in the chat a link to family-friendly article about HIPAA that includes more information about what we were just discussing. Also in the chat, a reminder, it's our Survey Monkey about today's training. So please open it before the Zoom closes so that you'll have that open, and we really appreciate your feedback. I think this has been an amazing opportunity for all of us to gather. Your questions were super well informed, and we could tell from your questions that you were really engaged in the content and really processing, how to potentially use this information. I'm going to give you a homework assignment that's completely optional. That homework assignment is to just sit with what you heard today and to think of one thing that you're going to do in the next month because of what you learned today. And if it's helpful for you, put it on your calendar, give yourself a deadline. But just sit with it and see what bubbles up for you. What one thing would you want to make sure that you take action on because of what you heard today or something that inspired you while you were listening today? We're not going to check to see if you did this homework, but the system's going to know because there's this revolution happening right now, and all of you are going to make things change.